Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. I'm Ian Bennett and I'm your host for Ian the Tech Bear. And today we're going to talk about the third computer that was really significant in my life. And we'll talk a little bit about the history over the next few parts. And today we are talking about a computer that had several interesting people in common. We're talking Andy Warhol, Debbie Harry, Front 242 is in the band, Calvin Harris, and even television shows like Babylon 5 and Star Trek Voyager. And I'm talking about the Amiga. And the Amiga has a really interesting history. A little bit of intrigue, a little bit of drama, actually quite a bit of drama. And definitely sort of the height of the Commodore versus Atari versus the PC versus Apple with their Macintosh. And also had a lot of challenges around its perception. So it started out in 1982 when a bunch of people left Atari. They were fed up with Atari and the management, etc. And they set out to create a new gaming machine that could be converted into a computer. The project name was called Lorraine, and it was financed by three dentists. And the company at the time was called Hi-Toro. And Hi-Toro decided that they would also raise funds by building accessories for, at the time, the Atari 2600 and the 8-bit PC line. And also, I think, for ColecoVision as well. And they created something called the Joy Board. So the Joy Board was pretty epic and not too different from the peripheral for the Wii Balance Board. So Nintendo wasn't the first on that particular piece of gaming kit. It was interesting for sure in those days as well. Eventually, Hi-Toro, under the name of Amiga Corporation, was bought out by Commodore, but not without its drama. You had the game crash of 1984, so which led to Atari to be sold off by Warner Communications. They were owned by Warner Communications at the time. But let's backtrack to about 1983. So in 1983, Hi-Toro and Amiga Corporation were actually being financed by Atari. And Atari had a 1-year exclusive use of the IP that came out of Amiga Corporation's work on the chipset that eventually became the Amiga. And of course, with the video game crash, they couldn't afford, but they sort of kept their hands on the technology, if you will, up to the point that Atari was divested from Warner Communications. Now, let's have a look at what's happening at Commodore at that time. Jack Tramiel was in a bit of a battle with Irving Gould about the path forward that Commodore was going to take. Jack was right to think that, hey, I want to start building a 32-bit computer because that's the future of computing. He was quite ahead of the curve thinking that way. I mean, considering at this point, Commodore had not just their computer lines, but they owned Moss Semiconductor. So, you know, had their chipset foundry. They had a lot going on. But those internal management struggles really were problematic. So by January 1984, Jack was out. So Commodore International was continuing on without Tramiel for the first time. So Jack decided to do a little bit of hunting around because he still wanted to remain in tech, and he had a vision for sure. You could definitely see he had a vision. He had approached a company called Mindset, and he also had approached Amiga. Now, The challenge with Jack was he was interested in the tech, interested in, acquiring the chipset, but wasn't really interested in the staff. And that showed, and we'll talk about that, where that really showed, which is unfortunate because you had some really brilliant minds behind the tech. So, you really had to think about the actual, not just, the tech that was being built, but also the people that were building it. But Jack was had, the blinders on a little too much at that point. So he got one of his buddies from Commodore, Shiraz Shivji, to start to develop a new computer. And when he realized that Atari was being divested, he, as in Jack, jumped in and actually acquired the company. So quite interesting. You've got people like myself and my peers and my friends who are very like Commodore versus Atari, yet the real Atari Commodore war was happening on management. And yeah, I thought it was really quite interesting that Jack Schmel had bought Atari. He got rid of all the remaining staff in Atari. He was really just interested in the technology that Atari had at the time, the IP, etc. And so with the computer that Shiraz had put together, and also with acquiring Atari, it came to light that Atari had an agreement with Amiga. I nearly said Commodore. Atari had an agreement with Amiga around the chipset, etc. Long story short, in August 1984, Commodore swooped in and actually acquired Amiga Corporation. Of course, with a whole bunch of lawsuits going on between Commodore and Atari. Commodore suing Atari and Jack Tramiel mainly because of potential IP that Jack Tramiel and Shiraz had actually carried with them to this new company. And then the other way because of the whole Atari having bankrolled Amiga Corporation to build the chipset and continue their work in development. It all was settled by March 1987 out of court. So we don't know what that agreement was. That would be interesting to understand what actually happened. And there you go. So you have the story of Atari versus Commodore versus Amiga Corporation versus what happened around that 1985 time period. I mentioned Andy Warhol and Debbie Harry because on July 23rd, 1985, the Amiga 1000, then just called the Amiga Computer, was launched in New York City to a massive fanfare and spectacle that you would expect for a computer like this. They had the computer playing music, they had it showing off its graphics capabilities, and they brought in Andy Warhol to paint Debbie Harry. So one of the really cool things that they did at the launch was they actually used image capture functionality to capture an image of Debbie Harry, and Andy Warhol painted her with the computer. He had, I think it was his first real experience on using a computer. And from that point on, the Amiga was very associated with all kinds of graphics and artistry and you name it, graphics wise. The computer was taken seriously in certain areas of industry and not so seriously in other industries. So what do I mean? What am I talking about? So in the creative world, so music and graphics and such, the Amiga was hugely important. In fact, it created a trend when it came to television production, etc. So for example, Babylon 5, all the VFX, etc., were all done by video toasters and Amiga 2000s, which was huge. It was either Silicon Graphics and super expensive hardware, or the Amiga with the video toaster, which was a total game changer. in that world. And however, in the business market, people were so had the blinders on with being so focused on IBM PCs and, VisiCalc and spreadsheets and programs like WordPerfect and word processing. They looked at the graphics capabilities and went, "Oh, that's for children." Despite the Apple Macintosh being out and being huge in desktop publishing, and WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get, word processing on the Mac. The Amiga could do it. The Amiga could do it in full color, where the Mac in those days was still black and white. The PCs were very much still green screen, although CGA graphics were starting to come in. But still, 4 colors versus 32, 64 with extra half bright mode, and up to 4096 with ham mode, hold and modify. So this computer could display some amazing graphics and do it amazingly. And of course, I've got two of my favorite games from Canadian distributor Discovery Software International, Arkanoid and Hybris. So Hybris on my Steam Deck and Arkanoid being played off my big PC here. And I've got, a retargeted, essentially 68030 clone currently, I think, running off my Raspberry Pi. So yeah, that's all Amiga OS running off Linux emulation there. So, so yeah, some beautiful graphics. And of course, later in the life of the Amiga, it could do even more colors. But again, that was seen as a child's toy, and all the, the fact that this could be used as a games machine, again, it was sort of seen as a toy, unfortunately, when it was hugely productive. I remember friends of mine and I having a talk with parents and saying, "Hey, this is the future." And if you look at computing today, it was the future. PCs have only, in some respects, it feels like they've only just caught up to some of the things that the Amiga could do in 1985, such as preemptive multitasking. You know, it was the future. Let's talk a little bit about my history and the Amiga. I think it was around 1989. Friends of mine had spent their summer working and had regular jobs outside of school hours, so typically on weekends, and had saved up their money to get their first Amigas. And they started out with the Amiga 500. I did the same thing, but it would be a year later. So in around 1990, I had gotten a job as a stock person at a local grocery store and was saving up my money to eventually get this lovely beast of a computer. Now, this is not my first machine, my first Amiga 500. I actually had sold it to a friend of mine in university, and I'll talk about why I did. But yeah, I saved up my hard-earned money to get this computer. It was $750 Canadian in those days. I remember that because originally they were being sold for $799. However, I talked the store down to $750. Back then, you could actually talk stores down and such. And it was actually at a trade show being held at the Canadian National Exhibition, a computer show. And my uncle and I both had gone to that show. And I had 700 with me in cash. Unfortunately, I didn't have the full 50. So I begged my uncle, could I borrow $50 so that I could get this computer? And he hummed and hawed to sort of think about it and stuff. And I was working at the time. Again, I was in high school and also working on weekends and sometimes after schools during the week. So he said yes, and I bought my very first computer. It was a big step. I was finally paying my own way on my computer journey at this point. So my dad had previously purchased my Commodore 64. My mom had previously purchased my Timex Sinclair 1000. So it was me taking that step into my own, and it was huge. I actually ran my Amiga 500 off a Commodore 1701 monitor. So the 1701 monitor that we had bought with the Commodore 64. The challenge being, interestingly, the composite port on the 500 is black and white. It's monochrome. On the 1000 that I have here, so this Amiga 1000 was given to me about, 3 years ago by my partner Stay. And it's full color on the composite port. So you could see that the 500 was a bit of a cost reduced version of the Amiga. To get around that, I got a 520 RF adapter, which went into the RGB port here. And it had composite video, so I could see color on my 1701 monitor. And that's how I worked. I didn't have enough money to pay for a 1084 or 1081 monitor. The 1081 was the original version that came with the 1000, and then the 1084. And there were 3 models that I can think of. The 1084, the 1084S with stereo monitors, because the Amiga had stereo sound, and the 1084D, which was, I think, just a slightly upgraded version of the 1084S. I used that computer as well as I could on a really horrible composite monitor setup. I loved every minute of it. This was an incredible computer. My friend Jeff first had an Amiga 1000. He was the first person that I knew with an Amiga. I think his parents had picked theirs up in 1986, maybe 1987. So right at the beginning when the Amiga launched. And it was mind-blowing seeing this thing. The graphical user interface, the fact it had color, the games, again, also amazing. So, one of the games that comes to mind is Blood Money from Psygnosis. The music, it was like having an arcade at home. Just amazing. But it wasn't just the fact that it was capable of playing these arcade games. It was capable of so much more. WordPerfect was available for the Amiga, just like it was also for the Atari ST. So it wasn't just for PCs. You had amazing what you see is what you get word processors, such as ProWrite, which I did all my assignments when I had the Amiga on, thanks to my friends for copies of ProWrite. I didn't learn much programming on the Amiga. And the reason why I didn't learn much programming on the Amiga at that time, I would have loved to have learned 68000 assembly. I sort of dabbled in a little bit of it, but not as much as I did 6502 on the Commodore 64, because the IDEs and the compilers were so expensive. A group of us actually paid in to buy, I think it was Lattice C, which was, I think, $599. So, between my friend Doug, Dean, and me, maybe Mike was involved, I'm not sure who else, but we all sort of paid in and got a copy on floppy disk. Now, most of my friends had hard drives at the time, and unfortunately, I didn't get my first hard drive until much later, towards the end of using my Amiga 500. But still, I ran off floppies, had an external drive, so I had 2 floppy drives, etc., and that was enough for me. I just used what I could of the system. Now, in 1995, when I first started my career in many respects. So I was still in school. I was at university in Ottawa, at Carleton University, and I had started my first summer job with Northern Telecom. At that point, it was just switching to the new Nortel branding. And I met one of my work colleagues, and we got talking about computers and our history with computers. And it turned out she had bought an Amiga 3000 in Frankfurt, Germany. And she was at a point, I guess, where She had a PC laptop and was more PC oriented. And she, of course, by that point, Commodore was about, was completely defunct pretty much. The Amiga was still going with SCOM and then eventually Gateway computers. But at that point, Commodore was no more. So she literally gave me her Amiga 3000. She gave me an Amiga 3000. Like, I was completely blown away. She didn't want any money for it, etc. She just literally gave me an Amiga 3000. 68030 base, 25 megahertz, single drive with a hard drive in it. And the ECS chipset, and of course the chipset that was with the Amiga 3000. Wow. I was completely blown away, and I was over the moon with that computer. And it also came with a multi-sync monitor. So an NEC multi-sync 3D, if anybody remembers those. You needed a multi-sync monitor because of the refresh rates that they used between 15 kilohertz and all the way up. So it was an amazing computer, and I loved having that computer. The design of that computer, I mean, the Amigas in general, at least with the 1000 and with the 500, and of course with future computers, the 1200, I should say, the CD32, the CDTV, the 600, all beautiful. The 2000, it was a big beige box, but it certainly had its own character as well. But the 3000 was a stunning piece of computer architecture, if you will, in those days. And of course, there were Unix variants of the 3000. The 3000 I had was not a Unix variant, but still, it was incredible. I took that computer with me to the United Kingdom. So I actually, just before leaving for the United Kingdom, I sold my Amiga 500 because I didn't feel like I needed it with the 3000 working. I didn't need those two computers. So I sold my Amiga 500 with a hard drive to a friend of mine. And I eventually did get I think it was a 1084, although I can't remember the model number now, monitor for the Amiga. Eventually, and it was a beautiful setup. But still, I gave it to my friends. They had said it died in a power incident or whatever. Who knows? But I took that Amiga 3000 with me, and here's the reason why. The school that I was studying at in the United Kingdom actually had a lab of Macs, and we learned a completely different language than we were learning at the school in Canada. So in Canada, we were learning Smalltalk and C and C++, where over there we were learning Module 2, a little bit of Pascal, in addition to C++. So the development environments were on Macs and Mac LCs, I believe. And here's the funny thing. My Amiga 3000, using an emulator like Basilisk, could completely emulate a classic Macintosh way faster than the original Macintosh. And the reason was because of the coprocessors in the Amiga, such as Agnes, Denise, Paula, Gary. So not everything was stuck on the 68000, where in the traditional Mac platform, the 68000s were doing all the graphics rendering and everything. There were very few coprocessors, I believe, in those days in the Mac hardware architecture. So I was able to take the development environment from the lab and actually work on my Amiga 3000 in my dorm room. I did all my homework in my dorm room instead of the lab. The lab was way too slow. Very slow in those days. And the cool thing about that Amiga 3000, with it having been bought in Germany, it was already a 240 volt version, so I could plug directly into the British mains, where here in Canada, I'd actually have to use a step-down converter, which I actually had. And yeah. So what happened to that Amiga 3000? So I actually decided to donate to the Personal Computer Museum in Brantford. So a gentleman by Sid Bolton was running a personal computer museum on his property, and he had this beautiful shed completely full of old school computers that were popular in Canada, and he was accepting donations, software, magazines. It was amazing. I had only seen the place once, maybe twice, but the when I donated my Amiga 3000 to him, and unfortunately he passed away a few years ago. But one of the really cool things that his family did was they approached the University of Toronto, and at University of Toronto at Mississauga, there is now the Sid Bolton collection. So it is essentially a library of retro computers and computing and history of computing, and a good portion of his collection is with the University of Toronto. And I think that is completely amazing. And while I've not confirmed yet, I actually have a few donations that I'm going to be making to them. However, I've not actually confirmed they actually have my Amiga 3000 in the collection. I really hope it's still there, because it certainly was working, and just amazing.